Greetings and welcome to the Recombobulation Area. My name is Dan Schaefer. Thank you for joining us. Our guest today is Jeramey Jannene. He is the president and co-founder of Urban Milwaukee, a terrific independent publication that you should all be subscribing to. Jeramey covers City Hall and all things City of Milwaukee and does an outstanding job doing it. Jeramey, welcome to the Recombobulation Area.
Thanks for having me.
So you cover a whole lot of different things that are happening across our wonderful city. And there are a few things that I want to talk to you about today, about what's going on in Milwaukee and what you're doing in your coverage. And you cover really a lot of ground. So I would recommend to all of the Recombobulation Area subscribers that you should also be an Urban Milwaukee subscriber. But I invited you on today because you recently wrote an article about a topic that I've followed closely over the years, and that is the future of the Stadium Freeway. Wisconsin Highway 175, a less than 2-mile freeway spur on the west side of Milwaukee that runs from I-94 to Lisbon Avenue. The headline of the article, published May 19th, is Stadium Freeway Replacement Will Take Years More of Study. So before we get into that piece, I want to zoom out for a moment here to bring in some context for some of our listeners and viewers who may not have been subscribing to the Recombobulation Area 5 years ago. So 5 years ago, I wrote this multi-part series on the future of the I-94 East-West widening and expansion project in Milwaukee. It was one I spent a lot of time on. It was an in-depth piece, had multiple parts, had feature stories, had commentary. And one of the pieces of commentary that I had in that series was with the headline, Tear Down the Stadium Freeway in Milwaukee. So I thought that as part of this larger reconfiguration of the highways on this side of town, that we should look at this freeway spur that is dividing the city in many ways. And so about a year after that series was published, Mayor Cavalier Johnson, County Executive David Crowley, WSDOT Secretary Craig Thompson, and a number of other folks held this press conference at Washington Park overlooking the Stadium Freeway and talking about how they were going to initiate a study to re-examine the future of the Stadium Freeway and examine the possibility of converting that stretch to a boulevard and really reshaping the infrastructure there. So that press conference, and at the time they were saying that like this study would take about 1.5 to 2 years. Well, that press conference was held in May of 2022, and here we are in June of 2026, and now you are reporting that this study, this 1.5 to 2 year study that took almost 4 years, is now done, but they have determined that this is not going to result in any immediate action, but it is going to result in another study. So walk me through what the hell is happening here.
So what's been happening in recent months is we've finally gotten to the point where the project partners, and then this, by all accounts from everyone that was involved, was genuinely a partnership between the city, the county, and the state to do this study, are reporting back what they've heard through all these different meetings. So they went to the county board first. Graham Kilmer, who covers county government for us, reported on what was covered there, or what was said there. Then they came to the city and they got maybe not as warm a reception from Robert Bauman, the alderman on the Public Works Committee, because he was saying, well, really what you're telling us, you have these nice plans, but they're looking out 20, 30 years in the future because you need to do these other studies that were never done initially. And that is a NEPA study, which is National Environmental Policy Act study. It's the environmental impact study that all federal funding essentially requires. And that wasn't ever part of this. So you have this, okay, we want to replace the freeway with something different. There seems to be shared agreement on that. But as Robert Bauman puts it, you basically need to start over now to go through this formal federal process of affirming that.
So there's a couple things there. First, it is at least interesting to note that, as you suggested, there seems to be a lot of agreement on this.
There definitely is. There was 4 different options studied. One was simply rebuilding this 1960s freeway as is. It seems like there's very little interest in that. Then there's the nuances of these 3 different boulevard options, which are essentially stopping at different points, working your way back from Lisbon just kind of incrementally, like, do we want to go half boulevard? Do we want to go 3/4 boulevard? And there's questions there. There's also an issue of State Street at the south end where there's a significant elevation challenge and what the
Hmm.
design would look like there. The state actually modeled out a very expensive design that I wouldn't expect really to be pursued because it might involve things like the beloved Saz's State House having to be literally raised up to come match the height of the freeway.
Yeah, there are some challenges. It's not like the cleanest, easiest thing. It does, it was a project that required some study. Like you said, there's an elevation change in the freeway. There's the Menominee River to, consider as part of this project too. So like, you know, a study was warranted because they didn't meaningfully ever look at this as a possibility. But I think what is rather frustrating here is that this extended study took almost 4 years, and now they're looking at additional study to be able to actually do anything. And it just seems like we're seeing a somewhat similar story for the future of 794 in downtown Milwaukee, where it seems like we're just having a public information hearing and then a study and then another public information hearing and then another study. And then it's just like they keep just kicking the can down the road on making any actual determination, making any actual decision about what they want to do. But you also mentioned that Alderman Bauman had some specific study requirements or asks for this that it seems to be like should this have been part of the initial study? Is that
Yeah,
part of what he was raising as a question there?
I'll contrast it to what happened on 794 because it's a process that's taking a long time, but for a completely different reason. On 794, WISDOT, the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, goes into the project thinking that they're going to essentially do a minor change, most likely. They're going to rebuild the whole thing, but they're not going to do a whole boulevard or anything. And what was requested by advocates in the city was let's do a full study of what the boulevard would look like. And we've now seen the outcome of that. We've gotten to the last public meeting there. And as part of that process that's dragged on, it's dragged on because they pivoted to doing the full NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act review there. So they expanded the study in the middle of it. What happened on 175 here, the Stadium Freeway, is that you had what was supposed to be a relatively fast study, as you've said, 18 months, 2 year study, that took essentially 4 years to get done. And I'm sure there's various reasons for that. And now we're being told, well, it never was expanded to this NEPA study. So now you actually need to do that, which is another 3 years and $10 to $14 million.
So at the end of this 4 year study, I mean, and that just seems like if they're projecting now that it's going to be a 3 year study, just add a couple of years on the end of that, because it seems like that's the case of like how every single one of these go. Like, why is this such a pervasive problem when it comes to these big infrastructure problems, big infrastructure decisions in Milwaukee? Like, why is the process so mucked up and slow all the time?
From a federal level, you have this NEPA requirement, which in many cases, when you're looking at the zoo interchange, that NEPA process was what was used to generate that settlement to pay for what ultimately became some short-term suburban bus routes. But the
Mm-hmm.
NEPA process is very much about dotting your I's, crossing your T's, making sure every environmental consideration is made. And I'm not just talking about like, well, is this endangered flower found there? But what are the air quality impacts? What are the traffic safety impacts? When the I-94 project that's now being built was killed under Governor Scott Walker, they shelved the project. When Tony Evers brought it back, they had to do a supplemental, essentially NEPA process, which took, I think, somewhere in the ballpark of 9 months to get done.
Yeah, that was when they requested like the further study because they had not meaningfully studied the option that many people were proposing, just like the fix at 6 and not, rebuilding the highway without adding the additional lanes to it. That had never been meaningfully studied. So I think that, brought part of it, but I just feel like we're seeing this same story play out over and over again with these big infrastructure projects in Milwaukee, where we have, a big exciting idea. I mean, exciting for me seeing the Stadium Freeway, less exciting to widen the highway, but it reconfigured the Stadium Freeway. It was a lot of excitement around this when it was announced in 2022. And then it's just like we started, seeing some of the public involvement hearings. They released some of the renderings. There were these, at the Washington Park Senior Center, they invited people to like go in and walk around and take a look at what this might look like. But it just seems like we get so bogged down in process that it makes it impossible to make an actual decision. So like even with this, 3-year, up to $14 million study, like do you anticipate that at the end of this, they're actually going to make a decision that would reconfigure the Stadium Freeway? And
I
who gets to
suspect
make that
that's
decision?
well, that is a key consideration because what we're seeing right now on 794 is that you've had all these public meetings, and then the decision kind of gets made behind closed doors and pushed to the legislature. And behind those closed doors are both WISDOT and area stakeholders. And in that case, it means the city of Milwaukee, Milwaukee County, but it also includes St. Francis and the communities to the south. So when you're looking at what's going to happen with the Stadium Freeway, you're likely going to have like Wauwatosa involved, even though Wauwatosa doesn't directly border the project.
Hmm.
But they have, as a Wauwatosa residents in the community, they have clearly people from that community use the highway. And what do they want? That all gets taken into account, but largely behind the closed doors. And then you get to the real rub of why no one is rushing to fix this problem. It's because it needs to get into a funding queue. And even if the plans today were shovel ready, the state of Wisconsin does not have money to build this road.
Hmm. So, uh, and that like gets to the larger connection of like how federal highways are built, or how um what the connection between these studies and how the funding works and all of that too. um but at least from the city level, like when you were watching this committee hearing, and you quoted folks from Department of City Development, quoted folks from the Common Council. I mean, what was the reaction to seeing this completed study, incomplete as it was?
uh, Alderman Peter Bergelis, who started this process as Supervisor Peter Bergelis on the county board, he's very supportive of definitely rebuilding it in some way, but also trying to do something quickly, like what improvements can be made now, even before you rebuild the whole roadway. You had DeAndre Jackson, who represents an impoverished district just north of the north end of the freeway, asking like, well, why aren't you studying like real mass transit options through this route? There is right now no bus route that serves this highway. The official planning document, the study results say that MCTS, Milwaukee County Transit System, is very interested in a boulevard option because it could allow them to actually add a bus route to this area. And then you had Charlene Moore, who represents the west side of Milwaukee, talking about that redevelopment or reconfiguration of the highway could result in a lot of land opening up for housing development, something that isn't really an option today on the west side of Milwaukee.
Yeah, I think that was a really good point made by Alderwoman Moore, my alder person here on the west side of town. And I think that's a big piece of it too. I mean, this is, there have been a couple stories in the news recently about how housing in Milwaukee is becoming more and more unaffordable. And I think part of that is a supply problem, and it is about, being able to build new housing, because as much as, many people, myself included, might like to live in a 120-year-old house, not everybody does, and so I think we need some new housing in the city. I think this is such an opportunity for that. I thought some of what was happening with the Brewers deal should have been looked at as an opportunity for new housing here too. And I think there's such potential on this side of town to build new housing, to open things up with this type of reconfiguration, that like that should be listed as one of the priorities for this too. Um, how would that move forward, at least in terms of like a city development, common council, city government level? Like what type of levers or incentives could they include to really advance this and move it along?
The sausage needs to get made first on and looking at like how the Park East Freeway played out,
Yeah.
removing that, turning that into a boulevard. You need to figure out how it's going to be funded to convert the freeway into a boulevard. Is there going to be local funding required? And if there's not local funding required, that's likely going to give the city a lot more flexibility with tax incremental financing, which is essentially borrowing future property tax revenue to pay for improvements up front, that they could get involved, they being the city, get involved in doing housing directly adjacent to this new boulevard, if they're not required to put the money up front to actually build the boulevard. And one of the things that'll be a huge driver of that is what happens in Washington, D.C. with who's president. We saw the Biden administration essentially put up $2 million for this study up front. And you have the Trump administration that's been more or less hostile to converting freeways to boulevards.
Hmm. Well, if this is going to take another 3 years to do this study, perhaps things might be different at that point. But that's another conversation for another time, I suppose. But I do think it is at least encouraging to see, some of the local officials here speak with some optimism and about what this converting to a boulevard might be, and generally seeming the fact that whether there's questions about mass transit, whether there's questions about housing, like the fact that people seem to be on board with this, I think is really encouraging. But I just wish we would be able to move this along and make this happen sooner. I think I think the same thing for 794. I wrote a piece about the future of that in 2023. And here we are 3 years later, and we still haven't made a decision. I think that is one of the biggest problems with this. People don't see these changes actually coming in their lives when these big things get announced. And then, like we've seen with the I-94 East-West, all of a sudden it's like 5 years later. And then, yep, this is going to take 8 years. It's going to close this bridge. It's going to close that bridge. There's going to be this long-term problem with it that goes underexplored. And I think, if we just get to a point where we can make these decisions more quickly and efficiently, perhaps people wouldn't feel so disconnected from the process. Because as somebody who showed up at so many of these different public hearings, it just feels like you're not being heard, and people aren't prioritizing actually making a decision on this. So that is,
I think that's a fair criticism of how slow many of these public works projects move. Is they are not fast moving things for reasons that defy belief in many cases, and often aren't local decisions on why they're so slow moving. One thing I did want to point out, I think I misspoke earlier when I said the Biden administration put up $2 million for this. The WSDOT deserves a lot of credit. On the 2022 announcement, city officials were really relieved to hear that WSDOT committed to funding the study without having to shoulder a local city or county burden on it.
At least there's that. That's WSDOT spending almost $2 billion on widening a freeway can spend $2 million on, looking at something that might actually be beneficial for the residents of the city. Think of that. You cover a lot, so let's move on to another topic that you've been covering. Individual that has been, a source of controversy over the last few months. Marty Brooks, the CEO of the Wisconsin Center District. You I think published a story on this today. We're recording this on Wednesday afternoon, but here at the Recombobulation Area, we recently hosted a podcast with Gary Witt of the Pabst Theater Group. He had some very critical things to say about Brooks and his handling of a study about a potential convention center hotel. And between that and a variety of other reasons, we don't need to get into every last one. But Brooks has been on the hot seat. So what's the latest with what's been happening with Mr. Marty Brooks?
Well, the latest is that Marty Brooks's office, to the surprise of the very people that report directly to him, was cleared out yesterday. That Marty gathered up his things, walked out of his office, and couldn't tell anyone why. And this is just the latest twist in this strange saga, which has had a year ago. Everyone loves Marty Brooks. He's done what seems to be generally agreed on a great job developing the $450 million Baird Center expansion. And now this convention center hotel expansion has snowballed into something that's resulted in him on the verge of, if he hasn't by now, losing his job.
It's pretty wild. I mean, I used to work for a couple of the business news publications in town, and I think each of them celebrated him with some sort of honor. I don't know if it was like CEO of the year, executive of the year, something like that, but had really celebrated his work leading the Wisconsin Center District. Um, that oversees the convention center, the UWM Panther Arena, and Miller High Life Theater. That was an organization that I would say was not particularly well run, maybe a decade ago or so, when it was under the direction of Frank Gimbel. And I think, it had been getting much better under Brooks's leadership. And I think a lot of people were really encouraged about the Baird Center. But then all of a sudden, this Hunden Partners study to potentially tear down the Miller High Life Theater, to build a convention center hotel. It seems like Brooks was not really forthcoming about um what that study was, whether he had his thumb on the scale. Like, this has really progressed in a pretty bizarre way, hasn't it?
It certainly has. So what going back to May 2025, Brooks announces to the board, "Hey, I'm initiating this study with this group called Hunden Partners. I just want to study all our essentially what he called capital assets, looking at the arena, at the theater." They obviously knew what the Baird Center was and what the capital plan was there because they had just expanded it. But what is the long-term costs associated with these other venues that we own? That study starts. There's room there, maybe demolition could be considered. So you get historic designations for those two properties, which Brooks opposed. He at the time says, "I have no plans to demolish them." When he announces the study, he has no plans to demolish them. The study ultimately comes out in January, and it has what to me reads like a recommendation to demolish the theater because it has a rendering of a hotel being built where the theater is, and it has a
Right.
scoring rubric that says the theater and the arena are the best sites to develop a convention center hotel. And the justification is this large convention center hotel would help you utilize the Baird Center expansion, that they would have a symbiotic
Hmm.
relationship together. But what you have kind of coming out of the woodwork, then you talked with Gary Witt at the Pabst Theater Group, who books shows at the High Life Theater, is that Marty apparently, according to Gary, told him in advance, no, the study's going to recommend the Panther Arena. I'm told now that another source has come forward to the board in an investigation and said they were told that their tenancy at the Panther Arena would have to end by 2029, that the building was going to be demolished. So you have these things behind the scenes, and then you have the board now being very open about that they're frustrated with this study, that it didn't really tell them a lot. Robert Bauman, the alderman, calls it a waste of money. Grady Crosby, a board member, says it was kind of thrust upon us. And Greg Marcus of Marcus Corp says, "What I asked for was a strategic plan, not a hotel pitch."
Mm. So not a lot of support on the board for this proposal. I mean,
No,
is
and
there
my
anyone? I
understanding,
mean, the board is kind of constructed with, I think there are various appointments from the city, county, state, like a variety of different levels of our government here in the state of Wisconsin and in the Milwaukee County that contributes to this. Is there anybody who's like in favor of this?
I think there's people that are in favor of the convention center hotel as an idea. It doesn't seem, and what's shifted in the last couple of months is no one seems to be happy with the process here, how it's made everyone look. And then I'm told, in discussion with multiple sources, there was an investigation that was initiated. They found some other concerning things, none of which are criminal, but just I want to be very clear about that. But just things that Marty might have overstepped his authority in different spending areas, different things he told people.
Interesting. So is your expectation now that as you reported he cleaned out his desk, is your expectation now that that the board will fire him, that he will resign? I mean, what's next here?
He has a 3-year contract that expires in 2028, and there's
Okay.
an issue in it that if you fire him for cause, you don't owe him anything. If you fire him for
Hmm.
convenience, so the board has the right to fire him, you owe him 6 months of his salary. Brooks is one of the highest paid public employees in the state. He makes more than $400,000 a year, and there seems to be a desire not to spend that 6 months of money. So there's a negotiation going on.
I see. So perhaps the conclusion of this will be some sort of agreement exit situation.
Yes, I think
Perhaps.
that's
Yeah.
likely. I'm guessing we're going to get that this week, especially with his desk being cleared out.
Yeah. That's a wild one. All right. Another topic I wanted to talk to you about. You have covered a whole lot about Milwaukee's lead pipe program over the years, and this is something that has been back in the news recently. Congressman Brian Stile of the First Congressional District was celebrating some funding that was going to be coming to lead pipe replacement in the state of Wisconsin. He talked about how he was bringing it to the state, and turns out that this was funding from the bipartisan infrastructure law, which, as far as Wisconsin's members of Congress go, was not a bipartisan vote. There were no Republicans who voted for the bipartisan no Republican members of Congress in Wisconsin who voted for the bipartisan infrastructure law, Style included. So that got him in some hot water. But I think beyond that, what is actually happening with the lead pipe program? You had a piece recently with the headline, "Why Milwaukee's lead pipe program is cheaper, faster, and still at risk." So what is actually happening with this?
So going back several years now, the city has made a very deliberate attempt, with the support of federal funding allocated by the state down to the city, to really scale up its lead service line replacement program. So we're talking about the pipes that connect homes and businesses to the city's water system. That pipe is often, in many cases, as old as the house it's connected to, and it's made of lead. And that's one of many different ways lead can get into your body. There's no safe amount of lead. There seems to be general agreement among scientists, among city officials, federal officials, that lead paint is a much bigger risk, but that any amount of lead and lead in water, here's something we can remove. Unfortunately, there was, at the time the city got serious about this, about 70,000 of those pipes buried in the ground. The city starts, yeah, a lot, and at a cost of more than $10,000 each, that's a $700 million problem to fix. So the Biden administration got very interested in this. Joe Biden actually came to Milwaukee to tout the city's success scaling up. The city's gone from struggling to do more than 1,000 replacements a year to last year it did almost 3,500 of its goal. And now this year it's aiming for 5,000. And what's also happening at the federal level is later this year, what's known as the lead and copper rule, an updated version of that goes into effect that says cities across the country, you have 10 years to replace all these pipes. Well, the Biden administration made an implicit promise that we're going to fund that work. Now the risk is cities doing really well, costs are falling to replace these, but the Trump administration might cut off the funding tap.
What do you mean by that?
So the way these get replaced, every lead service line has a public and private side, publicly owned by the waterworks, privately owned by the homeowner. The federal government, under the bipartisan infrastructure law, essentially said, we'll cover all of that cost through this revolving forgivable loan fund that will allocate the monies to the states. The states will give it down to the cities based on need. The city of Milwaukee knew it didn't get enough money up front, whole state of Wisconsin, but it knew states like Arizona that don't have many lead pipes, their money would be getting reallocated. Basically anywhere that there's newer housing, that money would eventually get reallocated more or less to the Midwest and East Coast. That started to happen, but now the Trump administration has proposed a 90% cut in that loan fund for the 2027 budget, which would imperil work years into the future.
Yikes. And so that it's just purely a federal decision. There's nothing that like state or local lawmakers could really do to impact that.
Yeah. So that the problem then really would become is you have a federal law that says you must take this pipe out of the ground, and then you have the federal government not giving you money to meet that mandate. So all of a sudden the Milwaukee Waterworks, meaning the city of Milwaukee, is going to have to come up with the remaining $500 million it might need to meet that 10-year timeline, instead of going on the much slower pace it was already on.
Well, hopefully that Milwaukee will continue to get some of these funds. Will continue to make progress. It is at least encouraging to see that like there's been momentum. Like they are fixing more lead pipes now than they were a few years ago, and that is at least encouraging.
Yeah, I think what really is encouraging to me, we talk so much about government bloat. We talk about this study issue, how long things were taking. This is a classic case of economies of scale really working, even for the government, that the cost every single year since 2017 has fallen to actually do this work. Contractors are getting more efficient and taxpayers are ultimately benefiting.
That's a good thing. That's a good thing. We should celebrate that. It's pretty rare in this day and age that we can celebrate at least some level of progress on that front too. One other story I wanted to talk to you about was a story about housing. We talked before. We mentioned before that Mayor Cavalier Johnson designated 2026 as the year of housing. One plan he recently announced is at King Park. You recently published a piece with the headline, as soon as it loads here for me, competing visions emerge for King Park housing plan. What's going on here?
Yeah, so we have a good news story, and it actually goes back to 1996. Pabst Brewery in the middle of the day just closes. So for at least a decade after that, you could walk through the Pabst Brewery on the northwest side of downtown Milwaukee, and you could see there was just stuff left on people's desks. They went to lunch, they didn't come back. We lost this legacy employer in Milwaukee. Joseph Zilber in 2006 enters the picture, working with Jim Hartle, who had already purchased the brewery. They initiate this redevelopment scheme. The city does, and it's a mixed-use neighborhood now. There's housing there. There's a hotel. There's UWM has its School of Freshwater Sciences. The city subsidized that through a tax incremental financing district, which we talked about earlier. That's essentially borrowing future property tax revenue to pay for the infrastructure up front. They got the streets fixed there. They made it essentially a neighborhood street grid instead of this private brewery campus. Well, that debt is all now paid off, which means under state law that you can spend that increment, which is a couple $1,000,000 a year, anywhere within a half mile of that district. So you're looking across Interstate 43 into a very different type of neighborhood, and they're looking at redoing tons of streets, but they're also looking at this cluster of vacant lots that were created back in the 1960s and doing affordable owner-occupied housing on it. There's competing visions now that have emerged for what exactly should happen there, but there is unanimous agreement that housing development there being funded by downtown development is a great thing.
I agree. This is a great thing, and we talk about bringing development beyond downtown in Milwaukee so often about whether this is really going to ripple out. And here's like a legitimate, concrete example of a way in which that like development in downtown has led to more money for the city and is now being able to be utilized to build up this area around King Park. And I think this is, a part of the city that makes sense to invest in, makes sense for housing in particular. It's close to a lot of, kind of transportation corridors in a variety of different ways in the city too. And so I think this, could be a really good thing. And they're putting a fairly substantial amount of money into this redevelopment plan. Is it 22 million? Do I have those numbers right here?
Yes, it's $22 million. Most of it is actually going into streets. Basically, every street within a half mile of the Pabst Brewery is getting repaved. Many of them closer to downtown, MLK Drive near Pierre Marquette Park, that was already repaved. We're looking west now. There's a lot of streets in rough condition there. Some of them are being reconstructed. Some are just asphalt with a new layer on top. And then we're looking at $3 million into housing. And again, the vision is affordable, so partially subsidized owner-occupied housing. Costs $250,000 to build the home. You sell it for $150,000, and the city covers that gap. And hopefully, you're creating equity for generations of people.
I like the plan. I think it's flown a little under the radar. I think this is a good one, though. I think people should pay attention to this one, and I'm sure you will be continuing to cover it at Urban Milwaukee. And people should, of course, as I said at the beginning, you should subscribe. You should check that out. You should follow Jeramey's reporting. Jeramey, thanks so much for joining us at the Recombobulation area today. You've been generous with your time, insightful as always, and appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me.